Hi, glad to see you on my channel. Don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel. It's important to me. Have a good view. Prior to the outbreak of World War II, WW2, the U.S. Army commanders paid little attention to their tank forces. For the development of new tank models in the pre-war period, from the U.S. budget annually allocated the sum of $85,000. For comparison, the cost of one production M4 Sherman tank of various modifications in the early 40s reached $45,000, $57,000. As a result, before the German attack on Poland, the U.S. Army had only 18 M2 medium tanks in service, the design of which was imperfect and, compared to German and Soviet analogs, hopelessly outdated. The rest of the American tanks were light, and in case of a collision with enemy armored vehicles, could do little to counter it. The situation changed somewhat with the outbreak of World War II. The Americans hastily developed and adopted the M3 Lee medium tank, which in many respects repeated the layout of the M2, but was better armored and armed. However, even this machinery did not suit the American military, and in 1942 the troops began to receive a medium tank's M4. They could fight equally with German KPFW-4, which the Americans called simply fours. But already on December 1, 1942, in the African theater of military operations, appeared German heavy machines, KPFW-6 Tiger. American tankers had nothing to oppose these monsters, although the work to create new armored vehicles in the U.S. was underway. So, in December 1942, they planned to start production of the M6 heavy tank, which was under development. But tests revealed a lot of shortcomings. So, in 1943, the work on its improvement continued. As a result, the vehicle was produced in an experimental series and did not take part in combat operations. In January 1944, in Tidworth Downs, Great Britain, where the main armored base of the Allies was located, the High Command of the Expeditionary Forces held a review of the available military equipment, as well as samples of promising weapons developments, some of which were presented not even prototypes, but frames of video chronicles filmed at the test sites. Particularly fierce debates raged around the T-26E3 medium tank, which was created just to counter the German Tigers, thanks to the long-term development of a whole series of experimental and serial tanks, such as the T-20, T-22, T-23, T-25, and T-26.
The T-26E3 tank passed a full cycle of tests and was approved by commissions of both the Supply Service and the U.S. Armored Forces. The Detroit Tank Arsenal was ready to put the vehicle into serial production. The vehicle differed slightly from the already produced T-23, and only the approval of the Supreme Command of the Allied Expeditionary Forces was required to start production. Moreover, the schedule for delivery of the new tanks to England was also developed, so that they got to the combat units to the beginning of the Operation Overlord to land in Normandy. The commander of Combat Group A, 2nd Armored Division, Brigadier General Maurice Rose, whose units were the first to meet in battle with the German Tigers, and on their own skin felt the superiority of these tanks over the American. The strongest advocated the adoption of new armored vehicles. Many other British and American tank generals supported his point of view. However, Lieutenant General George Patton, who commanded troops during the African campaign and the landings in Sicily, believed that the Allied Expeditionary Force had no need for a new heavy tank. According to the doctrine of armored forces, outlined in the then U.S. Army regulations, tanks were to avoid engagement with enemy armored vehicles, entering the prepared infantry, artillery, and aviation breakthroughs, then breaking out into the operational space and smashing the enemy rear and communications. Modernized medium M4 Sherman could well cope with these tasks. The M26S were much more expensive, consumed more fuel, had less range, and therefore, from Patton's point of view, seemed less preferable. Fighting the enemy's armored vehicles and supporting the infantry was entrusted to self-propelled artillery units. As a result, the Army refused to launch Pershing in series, which then cost the Allied Expeditionary Forces hundreds of lost tanks and thousands of dead tankers and infantrymen. American and British commanders believed that at the front, Allied units would not meet a significant number of German Tigers. The fact is that the PZKPG-6 was an expensive machine. The production of one unit cost the Third Reich 250,800 Reichsmarks. For comparison, the PZZ KPF 3 cost 96,163, and the PZK Puff W4 103,462 Reichsmarks. In addition, these tanks were more needed by the Wehrmacht on the Eastern Front. In general, the American generals were not mistaken in this, but miscalculated in another way, not foreseeing the appearance of the enemies more advanced than Pudkokov. 4 medium tanks. Already in the 20s of January 1944, during the landing operation in Anzio, units of the Allied Expeditionary Forces faced Pzykowf 5 Panther, the frontal armor of which Shermans could not penetrate. However, the number of Panthers on the Western fronts at that time was still small, and the Allies did not attach much importance to this fact. However, after the landing in Normandy, where almost half of the German tank forces were equipped with PKP Flowboy 5, the Americans were in a difficult position as they had nothing to oppose the Panthers. In the fact that the famous General Patton made a cruel mistake, the American tankers were able to make sure already in the July battles, when they began to lose their tanks and crews one after another, powerless to somehow affect the situation. Allied expeditionary forces were saved only by the overwhelming advantage in the air and numerical superiority of artillery and infantry. Finally, in November 1944, the top management realized that it could not go on like this and ordered the production of 2,000 T-26E3 vehicles. At the tank production, it is usually called Fisher Tank Arsenal, created for budgetary funds and given under the control of the corporation General Motors. In November 1944, produced 10 first T-26E3 in December 30 and January 1945, 70 in February, 132. The Detroit Tank Arsenal, operated by Chrysler Corporation managers, joined production in March 1945, bringing the two plants to a combined total of 194 vehicles that month. In all, the U.S. industry produced 2,000 tanks of this model by the end of 1945. The first T-26E3S arrived in Europe in February 1945. Already in March, they were assigned the M26 indexes as battle tanks, and the traditional for the American troops nickname Pershing, in honor of the American general who commanded the U.S. Expeditionary Corps in Europe during the First World War. What were these tanks, which according to the calculations of American generals, were supposed to fight on equal terms with German armored predators? In fact, the tank lost to its German counterparts in armor and armament. The 90mm M3 cannon was larger in caliber than the 88mm KWK 36L56 gun, which was installed on the Tigers, as well as the 75mm KWK 42L70, which was equipped with the Panthers. At the same time, the American gun had a worse penetration ability, as the initial velocity of its projectile, 853 m/s, was lower than that of German tank guns, which had a velocity approaching 1,000 em/s when firing armor-piercing, subcaliber shells. The frontal armor parts of the Panther hull were less thick, 102 mm versus 80 mm for the upper part, and 76 mm versus 60 mm for the lower part, but were located at more rational angles of inclination. Otherwise, the tanks were almost equal in armor and mobility. Tigers still surpassed the American armored vehicles in all parameters, and therefore the crews of Pershing, although they felt more confident than their colleagues on the Shermans, but also lost when meeting with the German heavyweights. It was especially hard for American tankers if they met with the Royal Tigers, whose frontal armor was 1.5 times thicker than that of the Tigers and Pershing, and located at more rational angles of inclination, and the gun, even at a distance of 4 kilometers, could penetrate a vertical 80mm steel plate. To remedy the situation, in January 1945, the Pershing T-26E1 prototype was fitted with a 90mm T-15EE1 gun with a 73 caliber length, which in its ballistic properties approached the German 88mm Royal Tigers KWK 43L71 tank gun. 2 finished barrels stored at Watervliet Arsenal were used to speed up production. The T-15E1 was a tank version of the T-16 LL-73 towed gun, specifically designed to combat the German Royal Tiger. Its muzzle velocity reached 1,175 mm/s when firing armor-piercing subcaliber shells, and it could penetrate the Panther's frontal armor from a distance of 2,400 meters. The new prototype received the Index T-26E11. Its ammunition consisted of 1,250 mm long unitary cartridges, which created great inconvenience when loading the gun. The second prototype was equipped with an improved T-15E2 cannon, which was loaded separately. Because of this, the rate of fire of the new machine, relative to the standard Persian guns, decreased from 8 90mm M3 to 4 rounds per minute. To balance the heavy gun, which was 73 caliber long, 2 armored springs supporting the barrel were mounted on the tank turret. To balance the whole structure, a steel frame with counterweight was welded to the rear of the turret. In addition, the gun cradle was reinforced, as well as the gun guidance and turret rotation mechanisms.
The new tank was given the Index T-26E4, and both models with separate loading and unitary ammunition were tacitly dubbed Super Persianers. The T-26E4 was put into prototype production, and as a result, the total number of Super Pershings increased to 25 units. Structurally, the T-26E4 differed from the M26 only in the gun and counterweights. The undercarriage of the new tank remained the same, with 6 rubberized support rollers of 660 mm diameter and 5 rubberized support rollers on each side. Due to the rear location of the transmission, the rear pair of wheels was driving, and the front pair of wheels was guiding. The width of the tracks with rubber metal joints was 609.6 millimeters. Suspension was torsion bar with telescopic hydraulic shock absorbers on the first 2 and the last 2 rollers, while the first rollers were blocked with a sloth on a common balancer and had 2 shock absorbers each. The Super Persians were equipped with a boosted engine, which was also used in the M4A3 Shermans, a V-shaped 8-cylinder liquid-cooled gasoline engine, GAF V8 made by Ford. For the new tanks, this 550-horsepower power plant was still insufficient due to the fact that their weight was 13 tons more than the Shermans. Nevertheless, other tank engines American industry at that time could not offer. In the morning of March 23, 1945, among other armored vehicles, Super Pershing, near the town of Bad Honnef, transported on a pontoon bridge across the Rhine to the Remagen bridgehead. The 3rd Armored Division, together with the rest of the 7th Corps, concentrated on the northern flank of the bridgehead. The Corps was to cover the so-called Ruhr Cauldron from the south, and the 3rd Armored Division in this offensive played the role of the steel tip of the ramming stripe. Super Pershing entered its first battle in the final stage of the operation on the road from the Weser River to the town of Northeim. Retreating from a bridgehead captured by the Americans on the east bank of the river, German units left ambushes on the roads, blocking their advance by fire. One such firing point, set up on the slope of a wooded hill 1.5 kilometers from the road, opened fire on the advancing American column.
The Super Pershing, which was at its head, turned its turret and fired an armor-piercing shell at the enemy. A fountain of bright sparks, which flew up 15 meters high, said that the hit target was most likely a tank or SAU, which immediately detonated its ammunition. However, the American tankers had neither time nor desire to check what kind of object they had hit. The most famous and most controversial battle of the Super Pershing took place in Dessau on April 21, 1945. Staff Sergeant Joseph Madhuri's crew encountered a German tank, later identified as a Tiger by sea plotters, John P. Irwin, Super Pershing's gunner. The 3rd Armored Division stormed Dessau well prepared for defense from 4 sides at once. It managed to break through only after the artillery destroyed or swept away by fire numerous reinforced concrete piles and other anti-tank obstacles, which were blocking all entrances to the city. Super Pershing had reached one of the intersections in the city and was turning right when the crew saw a heavy German tank 2 blocks away at a distance of approximately 550 to 600 meters. Tiger rushed to open fire, but his shell flew above the turret of the American tank. Gunner John Jack Irwin responded almost instantly, putting a shell into the Tiger's upper frontal plate. But in the barrel of the Super Pershing was a fragmentation projectile, because the American tankers did not expect to meet in the city armored targets. As a result, the German tank did not suffer much damage. The shell ricocheted off the armor and exploded in midair. At this time, the American crew felt the shaking from the hit in the turret. It was never clarified whether it was the Tiger crew who fired the shell or whether the Super Pershing was hit by some other anti-tank gun. Anyway, the shell did not penetrate the armor, but only left a trace on it. Meanwhile, the Americans had time to reload the gun, and Irwin fired at the Tiger a second time. The one just ran over a pile of broken bricks and for a moment showed its lower frontal armor detail and even part of the bottom. An American shell hit this vulnerable spot, causing the German tank's ammunition to detonate and its turret to fly off the chase. Not a single member of the Tiger crew had time to leave it. Super Pershing did not linger at the defeated tank and moved further into the city, the fighting for which continued the next day. In these battles, Madhuri's crew hit another Persian Gulf 5 Panther tank, the first shot knocking out its drive wheel and knocking down the Caterpillar. The German 50-ton vehicle turned on the spot, and the second shell the Americans put into its side armor. As a result of the hit, the German tank's ammunition detonated. The crew of another German medium tank surrendered to Staff Sergeant Maduri without a fight. The German tankers did not want to test their fate and test the penetrating power of the long gun, which was armed with their enemy's tank. On American internet resources and in publications, from where the information migrated to Russian language resources, it is claimed that the Tiger, shot down by Madhuri's crew, was actually a Royal Peace KPF-1 6 aus Abad. However, there could not have been any Royal Tigers in Dessau. The nearest ones at that time were fighting as part of the 502nd SS Heavy Tank Battalion, 100 kilometers to the northeast, in Fürstenwald, trying to stop the Soviet troops rushing towards Berlin. So most likely the tank that was hit was a regular Tiger, as this tank was identified by John Irwin in his book, Another River, Another City. That said, it may well turn out that it was not a Tiger, but a PZ-KPF-W. 4 of the latest modifications that dueled with Madhuri's Pershing. The post-war life of the Super Pershing was short-lived. The machine turned out to be crude, slow-moving, unsuited to modern maneuvering combat with a very low rate of fire and too long gun. Therefore, the original plans to produce at once 1,000 Super Pershing canceled. The last photos of Staff Sergeant Madhuri's tank were taken at the graveyard of American armored vehicles, located near Kassel. Super Pershings, which remained in the U.S., were withdrawn from service in 1947, and in their bulk were sent for remelting. Some of them were used on tank ranges as targets. So not a single copy of this tank has survived to our time. Thank you for watching the video to the end. Forget to put a like and subscribe to the channel. It's important to me. See you soon.